Hi, hello, welcome.
Hello.
Welcome everybody. Great, as you join, could you please tell us where you're joining from in the chat? Uruguay, Mexico, Brazil, Peru, from all around the region. Nice, Argentina, Ecuador, Jamaica. It's amazing, great. Hi, Shamara. Great, so perhaps we can start. So before we start officially, just wanted to let you know that we have a simultaneous translation. So if you're joining from your computer, you can see from the menu at the bottom probably, there's an icon of a globe. And once you click on it, you can choose the language, English, Spanish, or Portuguese. And if you're joining from a mobile phone, you can do this by pressing on the three dots on the menu. So, in Spanish now, muchos saben que tenemos la posibilidad de elegir otros idiomas. Tenemos traducción simultánea. Pueden acceder a esto a través del menú principal, yendo a la opción del globo. Estos sí están uniéndose desde una computadora, y si están uniéndose a través de un celular, pueden hacerlo a través de la opción de los tres puntitos. And Fab, could you please translate for Portuguese, please?
Yes. Então, como a Anik explicou, a gente está tendo esse evento hoje com interpretação simultânea. Para vocês ativarem a tradução simultânea, vocês devem procurar aqui no bottom of the screen, na base de baixo da tela, um ícone do globo, e aí vocês vão poder selecionar português ou espanhol ou inglês. E se você estiver usando um tablet ou um celular, essa opção não é tão óbvia, aí você tem que procurar as três pontinhas ali, os três dots, que vão dar mais opções, e aí você escolhe ali a opção da interpretação.
Great, thank you, Fab. So my name is Anik Blanchard. I'm part of the Latin America team. I'm joined by my colleagues Fabricio, Richard, and Lucila. We welcome you, everybody. Feel free to post comments in the chat box. Please make sure to when you have the option of two, to address it to all panelists and attendees, so we all receive the comments. Also, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A section from the menu. Cameras will be off. So let's start. So why are we doing this? No, we believe that these standards are such valuable tools because they show what good teaching and leadership looks like. Interesting fact is that they are tied to our curriculum, but they're not, sorry, the other way around. They are aligned to our curriculum, but they're not tied to our curriculum. So they're basically curriculum agnostic. So all of the schools can use them, whether you are a Cambridge International School or you're not. We started this back in September 2020, so the translation of all of the standards, fact sheets, sub-standards, all of the web pages that are related to the standards. So it took us a long way, really long way, but as you will see, it's completely worth it because now we're able to reach much more school leaders and teachers because language is no longer a barrier. So without further ado, please welcome Sarah Turner. I'm delighted, Sarah, you being here. She's the head of professional development programs for Cambridge International. Welcome, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anik. Thank you. And good afternoon. I think just for people this afternoon, it's kind of nearly the end of my day in the UK, but good afternoon to you. Bear with me just a second. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And Anik, would you just be kind enough to let me know whether everybody can see? Can I have a thumbs up?
Yes, perfect, Sarah.
Perfect, lovely, thank you so much. So yes, good afternoon, everybody.
Sim.
Thank you. My name's Sarah Turner. As Anik said, I'm Head of Professional Development Programmes at Cambridge International. And what that means is I look after both the standards that I'm going to talk to you about today, and I look after our professional development qualifications, our PDQs. And these are sustained and embedded qualifications for teachers and for school leaders. And they talk to the standards, the two work together. So hence the reason that I look after that's my remit. We have a very small team in Cambridge, just me and 2 other people at the moment, but we're very close knit, as you can imagine, as a result. My background is that I'm from a teaching background, so I spent 15 years working in a variety of UK schools. I'm a secondary English teacher by trade and a head of department. So some of the things that I'm talking to you about today come from understanding what it's like to be in the classroom and understanding how some of these resources are useful. So thank you for your time over the next sort of half an hour or so. I think I'll talk to you about the standards, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end as well, so that you can ask me anything you want to. What I'd like to cover, though, this afternoon are, what are the standards? So Anik has given us a bit of an overview there in terms of the standards and the journey that the Latin America team have been on. But I'll tell you a little bit about the journey from the start as well, and why we've got these standards and why we think they're so important. I'll also then start to touch on how you might begin to use them, because it's all very well having them and them being available to you, but often the first question people ask is, yeah, but where do I start? What's the first thing that I need to do with these standards? And then, of course, how do we make them effective? How can they be something that becomes very much part of our school and what we do? And we can talk about some next steps as well. So a variety of things to get through this afternoon, but I'll start with the standards themselves. They came about back in about 2018. So, we started the translation of them, as Anika said, towards the end of last year, and that was a long enough process in itself. But the standards came into being in about 2018. And that's not to say that before that time, Cambridge didn't have standards. Of course we did. And we have a variety of different standards in different guises, really. Cambridge schools amongst you will be familiar with our Cambridge teacher and Cambridge learner attributes, which are themselves kind of a standard, if you like. We have standards to do with our school registration process and things like that. And the idea is that all of these standards should begin to work together. But what became apparent to us is that whilst we were implicit about standards and about what Cambridge thought good looked like, we'd never been explicit. And of course, until you are, you can't have something that provides a real idea of what that looks like and a benchmark for people to think about aspiring to. So it was important that we articulated these standards and that we'd begun to think about what they should look like and how they could be used. And we began that at the time in 2018 by doing some desk-based research, and we worked with a team of consultants at the time to start to get an idea of what standards look like around the globe. And I know from some work that I've been doing recently with the Department for Education in the UK, although we've got great standards for teachers in the UK, they're very specific, they're very pertinent to the UK market. They don't translate well into something that's international. And that's really what we were trying to achieve here, was something that spoke to all teachers in all Cambridge schools, in all schools actually, in terms of what it means to be a really excellent classroom practitioner and what it means to be a really excellent school leader. So that was really the guide under which we started to work, and we started to look at other local standards as well and pull together the very best of these. And once we had this outline, once we had these standards, at the time, we then started to workshop them around the world, and we started to ask people what they thought of them to try to understand if we'd hit the right mark. And we got some interesting feedback along the way. And one of the things it's really important to say to you at this stage is they are a guide. They are something which tells you what Cambridge thinks good looks like, but it sort of ends there. They're not punitive. They're not to be used in order to assess teachers or to assess school leaders. And that was one of the first questions we were asked about this. Is this something Cambridge are going to say we have to do? And I'm at great pains to say it really isn't. These resources are here for you to use if they are useful to you in your context. And so that's very much the way in which I'm introducing them to you today. The structure of the standards themselves is each one of that, we call these the standard wheels, and each one of these has 8 standards. The 2 speak to each other. So you'll notice that there's a correlation between standard 1 in the teacher standards and standard 1 of the school leader standards. And of course, that's exactly how it should be. You know, whatever decisions leadership are making about leadership, knowledge and understanding, that should be replicated and modelled and then seen within the understanding and the knowledge we expect to see in the classroom from our teachers. And you'll find that correlation throughout. So what's really interesting for schools is when they start to look at the standards to think about them as these 2 levels of standards that they can use on ways in which they can be joined together and used as something that's coherent across the school. Within each of the wheels, standards 1 to 4 are very much about what you might need to know to be an effective classroom practitioner or an effective school leader. And standards 5 to 8 are very much about what you do, so about practice. And again, you'll see that kind of replicated across the standards. So it sort of brings us on to why we would need standards, what the point is of having them. And as I say, I've touched on this a little bit already, and part of it is about providing these benchmarks. What does it look like in a really effective classroom? And often we get asked, what does a Cambridge classroom look like? And so the standards offer you a view of the kinds of things that should be in a Cambridge classroom. And interestingly, Anik made the point at the very beginning that these are curriculum agnostic. So it's just about good practice. So, you know, even if you are not a Cambridge school, these standards would be very useful for you in you know, as something to look at and as a guide to think about what good looks like. They provide us with something against which people can self-evaluate. So again, I said not so long ago that these are not punitive. They're certainly not held by Cambridge as things that need to be met and, you know, boxes that need to be ticked. They are an example of good practice, if you like. They demonstrate to us potentially what the Cambridge teacher and school leader attributes look like. So we have these, you know, all-encompassing statements, don't we? But what does it mean to be innovative as a teacher or as a learner? What does that look like in the classroom? And the standards provide us some of the shape for that. And finally, what is starting to prove really useful is a shared framework of language. And I know that, you know, many schools are moving their teachers, moving their leaders across the school to give them the power of the vocabulary around teaching and learning. And the standards provide that framework of discussion for schools. And so that when you have those conversations about teaching and learning, they're from a basis of understanding and a basis of understanding the references that are being made. So as I say, it provides a framework really, and what we'll discover as we move on is how you use that framework, and the way in which you choose to use that in your particular context is entirely up to you. And that's really, I think, the value here of these standards. So I'm going to just drill down a little bit into the standards. I know these are quite difficult to see, particularly if you're on a phone. So I will leave you with the link if you haven't seen it already, and so that you can download these documents and look at them in greater detail. you get a bit of a closer idea here of the Cambridge standards, but I wanted to look specifically at standard 5 here to drill down a bit further and to give you some more information. And I picked planning, teaching, learning and assessment because I'm sure the majority of people on the call, even if you're school leaders now, have been teachers in the past. So hopefully we're kind of coming from a similar experience base there. So what it's important to note is each one of those top level statements is underpinned by a greater level of granularity. And I'll show you under standard 5 in just a second. But there are 41 items in total across these standards. So there's a lot of information here, and there's a lot of shaping of that environment and a lot of explanation of what we mean by each of those standards as you drill down. And if I show you standard 5, again, apologies if the text is a little small, but what you'll see is that in the arena of planning, teaching, learning and assessment, we've then broken it down into planning for progression, setting achievable learning goals, understanding strategies, understanding grouping mechanisms. There's things about inclusivity here, about formative and summative assessment. And so you start to build up this picture of what it means to achieve that standard. And so you've got these ideas that you can use. And I think at this point, as you're starting to sort of engage with the standards along with me, you can see then that how you start to utilize these in your schools or in your settings or as an individual teacher in your classroom, it needs to be pretty focused. I think even taking standard 5 at top level is a tricky thing to do because there's such a lot that underpins it. But I have got some strategies for that and some ideas that will help you get started. That's the structure so far. I'll talk to you in a little bit about some of the tools that we provide in order to help you dig into those standards a bit more. But I also wanted to give you some ideas about ways to get started with them. And this has come from a school. So I said that one of the first things that I did was workshop these standards with Cambridge schools in order to get an idea of how they might be used. And one school had fed back that they sat down and they looked at it and they realised the enormity of everything that was there. And what they decided to do to begin with was just start to socialise the standards with the people in their school. And what was really interesting for me was that when they talked about the people within their school, they were actually talking about the people within their community, so much more broadly. So they weren't just talking about school leaders and they weren't just talking about classroom practitioners. They were talking about people in the office. They were talking about lunchtime supervisors. They were talking about cleaning staff, about teaching assistants, you know, all of these people that have a vested interest in the experience that students have in your school, and ultimately a vested interest in the outcomes that those students get. So, you know, we know, don't we, from research that that community impact on teaching and learning is vitally important. So hearing from that community is important as well. What this school did is they simply wrote one standard per half term on a big sheet of flip chart paper, and they stuck it up in the staff room, and they invited everybody from the school community to post-its to say how they'd been either living that standard or how they developed something around that standard. And what they began to do was develop this vocabulary, you know, as I was talking about earlier on, develop a way of thinking about the standards and allowing the standards to become part of that community. Just whilst we're thinking about community as well, standard 8, when you dig into it, is very much about the community. And of course, parents are part of this as well. And I think also allowing parents to understand these standards and how you're using them and how you're working with them, I think is also important. So a flip chart in the, you know, in the front entrance that allows parents also to add to it as well is interesting. And I'm thinking, you know, as a parent, I'm thinking about the support that I give my kids at home, actually, that are completely in line with, if not planning and teaching, certainly with learning and assessment, you know, in terms of the way that I support my kids to access the work that they're doing. So, you know, there are ways really here for the whole community to be involved. And it's about initially socialising these standards and making them more understandable, and I guess less frightening. And we'll talk about culture more, but I just wanted to make the point at the moment that there is a leap, there is a, yes, a bridge to be crossed, if you like, in terms of what this means culturally for a school. Some schools will be absolutely ready to embrace this wholeheartedly from the outset. Others will need to take some time to get under the skin of this and to reassure people within the school community that it is something collaborative and useful. It's not something that is used to measure and assess, at least not in any way that is difficult for people to understand. So that's kind of a way of starting at top level. The standards, and here the culture becomes even more important, the standards are also useful for self-evaluation. And this can be done at an individual level. So you could do this potentially as an individual classroom teacher, or you could do it as an individual leader. Or again, I've seen real success actually where departments do it together. So they sit down and they look at the standards and that they use the tools that we've provided in order to think about them holistically as a group. So where are we good at these things? Where potentially do we have challenges in terms of these things? So, you know, when you're thinking about starting, it's fine to start with a group, you know, a group response to these things, because sometimes actually that's easy, you know, and it means that it's a much more collective and collaborative way to get started. What we've developed are RAG tools. And if I just click onto the next slide, I'll show you a little bit about what I mean by those. And when I say RAG, it's a simple, excuse me, let's have a drink. I was making Fabrizio laugh because it's a hot 26 degrees in the UK today, so we're suffering. So that's why I needed a drink. We've developed these tools, RAG tools, which stands for red, amber and green. And the idea is it's a very simple traffic lighting system, which allows you to demonstrate how confident you feel about some of these elements of the standards. And you'll see that as far as the RAG tool is concerned, we take the standard statement. So don't forget, we're in standard 5 at the moment, which was about learning, planning, teaching and assessment. Excuse me, we've drilled down into 5.3, which is about teaching strategies. And now it's broken down again into a series of questions which ask teachers to reflect on how they meet the notions of that standard, and they would reflect on that against these RAG headings. And you'll see that actually we've been a bit cheeky here, and we've added not just red, amber and green, but we added red, amber and amber green as well. When we trialed this, it was a bit too stark. There was too much room for people to hide in the amber column, and I think this just provides a sort of greater level of self-evaluation. So what you would do then is you would go across and you would assess yourself. Do I use a variety of teaching and learning strategies in the classroom? You know, and then you would rate yourself accordingly. And if I go over onto the next slide, you can see that's exactly what my mythical person here has done. They've rated themselves against those questions. At the moment, these RAG grids are available online, and the way that they work is that if you want to fill them out as an individual, you insert an email address, and once that email address is inserted and you've filled out your RAG grid, that information comes back to you. It's private and personal to you. So when I'm talking here about the self-evaluation, it depends how it works with the culture in your school. If you think this is a really useful thing for people to do individually, they can fill out these RAG tools. The information will come back to them, and they might like to then share that information, but they might not like to. And that again is that's that bridge I was talking about that needs to be crossed. But you know, I think as a leadership team, that's something that you decide about how you start with this. Sometimes it's useful for leadership actually to model this. You know, if you think that the cultural element needs to be unpicked a little bit, you know, it needs to be modeled by leadership, it might be helpful to start at that level, and so that you can say, look, we've been through this self-evaluation process, here is the information that has come back, and we are sharing it with you because we want you to know that we're strong in some areas and we're not in others. You know, that's quite a powerful message, I think, to be able to give to teachers. And then perhaps lets them understand that it's also okay for them to be vulnerable too, and for them to go through this process. But as I say, I did want to make the point where, you know, when I'm talking about you, I'm talking about you as the classroom practitioner or you as the school leader, depending on your role. But please know that this can be entirely private and personal. You don't have to share this information because it can sometimes be tricky. And, you know, an anecdote that I have to share with you in that vein really is with a school that I worked with in Zimbabwe a couple of years ago. And I knew I was going out and I wanted them to start to use the standards. They were due to become a Cambridge school, actually, and this was their first experience of working with us. And I suggested that they might like to fill out the RAG grids, and we agreed that they would do something on active learning and they would kind of think about active learning strategies. And it was interesting. I underestimated the culture in that school at the time, because when the RAG grids came back, I saw that they were all tremendously confident. They all felt that, you know, they really had active learning down, and, you know, that was something that they were very much doing in their classrooms. When I was in the school, that wasn't the picture that I saw. And it was really an interesting and eye-opening experience for me about culture, because I think leadership had suggested that Cambridge wanted them to fill these things out, and so they filled it out in a certain way. So I think that messaging up front is something that's really, really important to get right, you know, as you move forward, so that you get the best out of the information that you actually glean. So my second example here is about using standards as a diagnostic. So if you can start those conversations, if it's possible to have them at individual level, then great. If not, maybe at department level, certainly at leadership level, but to be able then to have those conversations around, well, where are our strengths and where are our weaknesses? And of course, the information that you glean from that then it can be put forward for very formal professional development opportunities, you know, like Cambridge formal training, syllabus specific training, or our PDQs, but equally is just as useful in informal development as well. When you think about mentoring and coaching, pairing up people that feel really strong about using a variety of teaching strategies with people that feel less strong is sometimes just as valuable as a paid for course that you can do, you know. So it's what suits that situation and that teacher. And again, just to give you another little anecdote, a school that I've worked with in China, that's exactly the way that they use it. They've already addressed the cultural issue, and it's not terribly elegant, but that principle describes it as knowing your gaps, which is what he uses these RAG tools for. He uses them to say to teachers, tell me where you need professional development, tell me where you need the training. And then he uses our PDQs to fill those gaps. So because they're so closely aligned to our standards, it's a way of then developing his teacher to fill the gaps that he's identified through this process. And then, of course, he can reevaluate that as he goes on, but I'll share more information on that in just a moment. And the other thing that I just wanted to share with you as well is the way in which the standard statements themselves can also be used as a framework for interrogation. If you've got data, whether that be numerical data or, as I'm demonstrating here, this is qualitative data. And this came from another school that I've worked with over the years, who wanted to understand more about student voice. And so they'd instigated the use of student questionnaires. And this particular group of students had been asked about what helps, what does my teacher do that makes it easy for me to learn, and equally what does my teacher do that makes it more difficult for me to learn. And they've done like a force field analysis here that you can see. But of course, it's what you do with that data when you get it. It's not the collecting of it, is it? It's how you use it, and then how you use that to inform your practice going forwards. And it occurred to me that the questions that come through from the standards also provide a framework for interrogating this data. So how am I going to use this to plan for progression? You know, what do I get from this that allows me to think about how I can move that student on, or that group of students on? Similarly, how can I use this to help me understand how better to use group work or pair work in my next lesson? You know, this student says that he enjoys group work, so there are lots of things that I can do to capitalize on that and to make that learning opportunity better for that student or that group of students. And just a final example about goals, you know, how is it then that I can perhaps pair together 5.2 and 5.1? So when I'm planning for progression, how do I set goals that mean something to that student based on the information that they've given to me about them as a learner? So, you know, again, it's just another set of tools and another framework that you can use these for, which is useful, and just provides a starting point. Sometimes it's a starting point, I think, that's useful. So what do you do then if you're on this call as a school leader? You know, if you're thinking about where to start, I think, as I say, the idea is really you get to know these standards, you understand them as a team. And I think what's important for a leadership team as well is you need to understand the leadership standards, and then you need to understand the teacher standards. So you need to understand how they fit, like I said earlier on. And so you might want to workshop them. You might want to do the thing that I suggested, where you just for a while think as a leadership team about how you demonstrate these standards. And I think the idea then is to be able to really home in on the one thing that you want to focus on over that next period. There's, I think I said this at the beginning, but forgive me if I didn't. There is no expectation that you do it all. You couldn't possibly, it's too big. So, you know, the real benefit and value of this is finding the thing that matters to you at that point in time. Then, of course, you can start to workshop them in departments. Once you've got that focus as a leadership team, you can start to say to your heads of departments, look, our focus this term is standard 5. We're looking at learning, planning and assessment. So we want you then in departments to start to ask these questions of your team members and to start to demonstrate where you've got real strengths. And for me as well, I think there's strengths across departments, you know, in terms of the way in which they work with each other, and the different ways in which you teach certain subjects will lend itself to different things and will lend itself to different strengths. And having that view across the school and across different departments or different phases means that that is a really valuable conversation to be had. Then, of course, you familiarise your teaching colleagues with them, and perhaps, you know, the piece of paper in the staff room is a good place to start, but you start having those conversations around the standards. And at that point, then you can move into those RAG tools. I think, although, you know, we have worked with schools who have gone straight in and done all of the standards, and it's actually been a really rewarding experience for them, I think that potentially works well with smaller schools than it does for bigger schools. And of course, it will work well for some big schools and not for others. You know, it's about you as leadership teams know your staff, you know your students, you know your parents, and you know what will work for you. So that's potentially where it might be useful for leadership teams to start. And then, of course, as I said, do bear in mind that you've got this differentiation. You can ask everybody to fill something in individually. If you've got that culture, if you think that people will respond to that in a way that is useful for you, not like my school in Zimbabwe, where it actually just ended up being a fairly demoralizing experience. Or you can start with the group aspects. You know, I think sometimes working as department teams is really valuable. And I know, kind of reflecting on how I might have done this as a head of department myself, I can think about some really valuable conversations that we would have had, which enabled each of us to be able to say, hold on, I'm really good at that, but I'm not so good at this, you know, and so you can kind of have those useful conversations and useful sharing. And then, of course, it becomes a process. You know, you evaluate, so you use the standards to evaluate, you identify where you'd like to improve or where you can build on strengths. You address those areas for improvement, and then you remeasure to see if you can understand where improvements have been made, if you can move on, if it's worth still staying with that, you know, and kind of working on that harder before you move on. So it's a process. And I think that, you know, if you understand it in that sort of long-term view, then I think that's helpful as well. This isn't something you're going to instigate on a Tuesday and be done by Friday. You know, it's something that is going to exist with you for a while, hopefully. And that's certainly the way that we would hope it would work. So That's it really from me. That's an overview, hopefully some ideas to get started. I'd love to take any questions that you've got if I can be of any more help, but I will stop sharing and stop talking for a bit and do some listening. So thank you so far. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. And there's so many interesting aspects of this. You know, you can use it as an evaluation, self-evaluation, as a diagnostic tool. It identifies your strengths and areas for improvement, as you mentioned. And I think it's important to point out actually two things. No, one is that there's no right or wrong on how to approach this. No, actually there are so many ways of doing it. No, taking one standard, using it with the teaching staff, even putting it out of the open, no, so all the school community can look at it and give their own feedback. Even perhaps the maintenance team, no, can participate. And I think this sort of ties nicely in with the shared language that you mentioned, no, that this can give to a school. And this in turn fits in nicely with the fact that we now have them translated, no? So this sort of shared language can happen across all of the school and not be sort of stuck in the English section of the school, no? So I think that this can really help into building this sense of community, you know, across the school.
Yeah, certainly, absolutely, and I think that's really important. And I think that, you know, what I've just seen the question in the Q&A, which I think is fascinating, sort of speaks to what you're saying actually. But I'll wait until you tell me to answer it.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. You can answer it.
Yeah, thank you. So that the question in the chat is about, you know, a situation that you might have where teachers believe they're meeting the standards, but the students don't agree. And I think, you know, one of the things that has occurred to me as I've started working with the standards, that what we don't do at the moment, or what we've not considered yet, is how useful these are as a tool to socialise with students themselves as well. And I think there's a useful triangulation of data here that might come from a lesson observation, a self-evaluation from a teacher, and some sort of evaluative feedback from students as well that allow you to kind of think about it in the round. Because it's really difficult, isn't it, sometimes, feedback from students, particularly if it's not directly to the teacher, it's outside of that loop. It can be really harmful, but equally it can be really valuable in terms of enhancing your practice as a teacher. So, you know, if there's a way of triangulating that data, I wonder whether that's a useful way to approach it. Everybody has to agree, you know, everybody has to be kind of bought into that. But I wonder if that's helpful, because I think it's possible to work with the standards and make them student friendly too. We haven't done that, but I think it would be possible to do that.
That would be an interesting aspect, actually. And again, this talks about having this culture in the school, no? And having that sort of practice where you can receive the feedback and students are being honest about their feedback. And when you're doing the self-evaluation, for you to be honest on how you think your teaching is happening, no?
Absolutely, you know, and it's one of the most valuable things I think you can do as a teacher. At the end of the day, we step foot in classrooms because we want to make a difference to learners. That's why we're there. So I think, you know, and with the best will in the world, I can think of examples where I thought I've had a fabulous idea for how to get a certain concept across or something like that, and it's fallen completely flat. And you know, having that opportunity to reflect like that with your students, I think is really important. So yeah, I don't know whether that helps, Juanica. It may do. I hope it does.
And how challenging this may be of not to take it personal.
Yes, yeah.
No?
Absolutely. But you know, it's interesting you say that, because of course the more you do this, the more you ask for open and honest feedback, and the more that you are an honest reflector of your own practice, the more used you get to accepting feedback and changing things and moving on. It is hard at first, but it's, you know, it's something that we should all be doing.
Exactly. There's another question from Alini. how to motivate students who are not accepting the e-learning modality. So slightly off topic, but I think we can cover it.
The standards are good, Alini, but they're not magic. But do you know what we were saying earlier as well? I think what might be useful here as well is that having that vocabulary around the standards and having that opportunity to reflect as a teacher, I think gives teachers the confidence to change things and to, the buzzword is pivot, isn't it? To kind of pivot between the way that we were teaching face-to-face and the way that we teach online. And again, I wonder whether that's useful for students. I mean, it's been such a difficult thing to do to get people to engage. And even now, you know, it's difficult doing webinars when those cameras are off. It's daunting as a professional, isn't it, to speak to a bank of blank black squares, you know. So, and similarly for students, but I'm not sure whether the standards themselves would provide an answer to that. But having said that, a reflection on the types of strategies that you're using online and potentially why they're not engaging all students, it's a way of perhaps starting to think about that process. Yeah, I'm sorry, Alini, I wish I had the answer for you there. I'm not sure that I do, but I think the standards provide an opportunity for reflection on that as an individual and even as a department, actually.
Thank you, Sarah. We have another question from Isis. She's asking if the standards are aligned to international standards of PISA.
As far as we could, Isis, yes. So we did kind of try to align them as much as we could with international standards. So they won't be identical, but the feedback that we've had from people is that when they look at them, they say, yeah, these are pretty good. These are, you know, this makes sense to us, even though, you know, we're in Brazil or we're in Chile. It makes sense because they are international enough.
Great. We have another question from Keisha. She says, do you think reflection tools could be discussed generally before it is completed individually, before they are?
Yeah, absolutely, Keisha. I think it also, you know, something that comes out of my work with our professional development qualifications, our PDQs, is that being a reflective practitioner is not always natural to people, or it's not always where they've come from, you know. So I think, you know, having that conversation up front about what it actually means. And I always kind of, again, think back to the amount of failures I had, you know, not even as a new teacher, even as an experienced teacher. As I say, sometimes you do things and they just don't work, you know, and you have to reflect on that. And so I think kind of not only the introduction to the tools, but introducing people to what it means to be a reflective practitioner. I think that's really important. And I think it's time well spent. I think it stands you in great stead for the future as well.
Especially when our teaching approach, we demand that from students, no?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's one of our attributes, isn't it? Yeah, good point.
To be reflective, we heavily focus on metacognition, active learning, so they really understand how they learn best, no? So it's almost natural that we ask the same from teachers, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, I think kind of joining then a few of those comments together as well, you know, what we know from research around what will be expected of our students in the future is that they will, you know, we're preparing them now for jobs that don't even exist yet. So, you know, the ability to be able to, I said pivot earlier, but the ability for them to be able to pivot, you know, it's, you know, less knowledge based and more skills based. So all of those things are so important, and reflection is a key part of that, certainly.
So Sarah, I might put you into a pickle, but if you had to perhaps point or say 2 or 3 takeaways, 3 main concepts, ideas, advices, what would those be?
You put me in a pickle. So I think it would, for me, it's about the culture. So I think, you know, do start there and think about, because I think that a realistic reflection at leadership level about how ready your school is to really access these standards in a meaningful way. I think that would be my first starting point. I think the group aspect of it is really valuable. I think I'm really interested in the way in which that dynamic dynamic might work and the value that might come out of working together as a department. And then I think probably having a really clear view of what you'll do with that information, because it's, you know, and I think sometimes it's very easy to say, oh, we've got this fabulous new tool, let's go out there and use it. But what will you do? What will you offer? How will you not, you know, like I said about the principle in China, know your gaps and fill your gaps. How are you going to fill them? Because I think that's the important thing to move towards.
Great. And I was thinking about those, and I perhaps would also add that this is a process, no? It takes a while to create a culture, to develop it. If you already have a little bit of the culture already at school, as you mentioned before, you know, don't feel overwhelmed. They're quite big, they're quite comprehensive. As you mentioned, you can start in groups, you can start small. So it is a journey, just as becoming part of the Cambridge International family. It is a long journey. This is a long journey as well, no? It's completely worth it, of course. But it is a process, and it does take time to really create that culture and have them embedded in the general teaching and learning at the school, no?
Absolutely, but I think, you know, importantly, I think I think there's immediate relevance. I think from the first point at which you engage with the standards, there's a benefit. You know, so you're right, it is a process, and it might take a long time, but I think even just, you know, even downloading the document is a tiny step along that pathway to something that might be really valuable.
Definitely. Great. Okay, I think we have covered all of the questions. I think that there are no more questions. So if that's all right with everybody, as we usually say, we're giving back 14 minutes now of your life. Thank you so much for joining us from all across the region. It was lovely having you here. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Sarah, for this. And we really, really hope you find them as valuable and as useful as we find them. Thank you so much. I don't know, Sarah, would you like to say something else?
I was just going to say thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you for your hard work. Fabrizio, you set all of this up. So thanks to you. A big, big thank you for making this happen. And thank you, everyone, for joining.